we're glad to be able to host this Broadband Breakfast Club for October 2010. Before we introduce our moderator for today's event and our panel, we'd like to thank our sponsors for enabling us to have this event and continue this tradition of the Broadband Breakfast Club. Please join me in thanking U.S. Telecom Association, National Cable and Telecommunications Association, and the Telecommunications Industry Association. Also, I'll say something about the upcoming programs at the end, but we do have a survey for you to fill out. We're trying to get the feedback of you, our audience, and those who are interested in our broadband events as well as our intellectual property events. And finally, before our moderator, I do want to say that we're really grateful to have all of these panelists here with us today, but I owe a special debt of gratitude towards Charles Benton, who's here on my left. Charles has been a longtime friend and supporter of these efforts to get broadband information and to get broadband available universally. And it does need to be noted that Charles is one of those people most responsible for bringing me out to Illinois, where I work on a day-to-day basis with another organization, the Partnership for a Connected Illinois. And Charles is the chairman of the Partnership for Connected Illinois, as well as the Benton Foundation. And I just want to make it clear that broadbandbreakfast.com is no connection to Partnership for Connected Illinois, although we're very happy to have Charles here with us, as well as all of our panelists. And I would like now to turn to Bernie Aronson. Bernie is a journalist who's been following broadband and the broadband stimulus and has been a real close follower of developments of NTIA and RUS as the managing editor of Telecompetitor. You can read his full bio on the program. Please join me in welcoming Bernie.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning. Everybody hear me? I have to say that's the first time in my career I've ever been introduced as a journalist. So thank you for that esteemed introduction. Good morning. My day job actually is managing partner of Pivot Media, and we are a telecom industry marketing and strategy consulting firm. As Drew mentioned, we've been following the stimulus program pretty closely here over the past couple of years, primarily through a blog that we publish called Telecompetitor. And before I introduce the panelists, just a quick story. I do a lot of these types of panels, so I find myself, even though I do a lot of these types of panels, I still find myself a little nervous as I prepare and wonder what the reception from the audience like yourself is going to be. So as I was preparing for this one, I had a unique experience that I think is going to really help my efforts with that. I was in Las Vegas last week at another industry event, and I had a kind of one of those only in Vegas moments. I was getting up and going to the gym in the morning, good for me, right, getting my workout, and came across a totally naked man in the lobby of the hotel. And needless to say, a lot of commotion and one of those things you know, only in Vegas, right? And so I'm walking away, and as I'm walking away, I see security coming and the police and just creating all kinds of commotion. And I thought to myself, you know, no matter how bad this day might be, it is not going to be nearly as close a bad a day as that guy is having. Okay? So puts things in perspective, right? So let me introduce our esteemed panel here, and I think that you all have their bios in the program, so I'm not gonna read through all of them. Just quickly introduce them. First, we have Charles Benton, of course, the chairman of the Benton Foundation. In addition to that, he's had a long, distinguished career in media education and the entertainment business. including Public Media, Inc. So very honored to have Mr. Benton here. He'll have a great perspective to add to this discussion. Next to Mr. Benton is Jackie Jones, and Jackie is the Executive Director for the National Black Programming Consortium, which is a 30-year-old media arts organization that funds, distributes, and produces public interest media for all platforms. Next to Ms. Jones is Craig Settles. Craig, for 20 years, has been providing workshops and consulting services to technology organizations worldwide. Craig's a real thought leader on the subject of broadband and the Broadband Stimulus program, and also will bring a great perspective to this discussion. Last but not least, we have Lori Sherwood with Intercounty Broadband Network in Maryland. Lori is the broadband and cable administrator for Howard County here in close by here in Maryland, where she helped lead the 18-month effort for the $115 million BTOP Middle Mile Infrastructure Grant that recently was awarded to them under the One Maryland Broadband Network program. So great perspective, I think, of all facets of the broadband industry and specifically the broadband stimulus program. Drew warned me, please dispense with a lot of formalities in this type of panel and jump right into this because we don't have a ton of time and a lot of interesting things to cover. So I'm going to jump right in. I've got a few questions and discussion points that I'm going to ask of the panel, but we want to make this as interactive as possible and invite the audience to participate as well. So I'm going to ask a few questions, but more importantly, we want the audience asking questions. So I ask that you begin to think about some questions of the panel, and very shortly I'm going to open the floor to you as well. Since part of our edict today is, if you read the program, is to evaluate the stimulus program now that we're past the point of application and we're at the point now of actually funding some of these projects, I wonder if each of you would give the program a grade on an A to F scale and then explain why you would grade it in that way. Start with you, Charles.
Well, there we go.
Way to put you on the spot there, huh, Charles?
I think, first of all, I think the administration was very wise in focusing the broadband stimulus effort on unserved and underserved populations. This is the least contentious with the major providers because if they had not been served at all or they were underserved, this was a reasonable role for government to come in and be helpful towards the goal of universal service and in the 21st century, universal broadband. So I think the basic goal as part of the ARRA stimulus package was a right-on goal. Number two, I think the NTIA in its being able to professionally and effectively figure out as best they could how to make these awards in as rational a manner as possible given the time they had. I mean, to figure out how to give away $4.3 billion in 16 months, boy, I mean, it is really, it's hard. And the people under Larry Strickling, Laura Braden, with whom I was last night, Tony Wilhelm, and many others, I mean, the dedication of these folks and the willingness to work 24/7 to do this job right is very much to be admired, and we have to give them enormous credit because they flew against the conventional wisdom that if you're in government, you're not either good or trying hard, and that's not true with these folks. They were very good and trying very hard. So I think on those criteria, I have no problem in giving the broadband stimulus effort of the administration as part of AR&A.
So, not to put you on the spot there, but so what was your grade between A and F? If you were to grade the program on that scale.
You talking to me?
Yeah.
I think it's just getting started. So we can't obviously evaluate something that's just beginning. I think if I may make one other point, I think Larry Strickling making the decision at the very end, that is in June, July, to set aside $5 million of their funds to do a formal evaluation. By the way, is anyone here from ASR Analytics? Well, this is a shame, honestly. ASR Analytics was the one that won the $5 million award for evaluating the program and trying to measure the economic and social impact of these broadband investments, and they should be here. They should be here at the table, and I know that Drew did reach out to them. They're a relatively small company in Maryland, and it's a shame they're not here because I for one, would be very interested in how they're going to go about figuring out how to measure and evaluate the economic and social impact, because that at the end of the day is what this is all about. Yeah. We're building models. 6.9 billion sounds like a lot, and it is, and it's not 7.2 because 300,000 was clawed back in the jobs bill. So it's 6.9 billion sounds like a lot, but the industry is investing 30 to 40 billion a year. So if you think of it in those terms, it isn't all that much, though focused on unserved, underserved populations. It is, it's very, and the way to carry that on is through universal service reform. So anyway, I would give both the NTI and the administration an A on this one, with of course, being A on as far as they've gone. Yeah. So we have to wait for 3 or 4 years until we really see what the impact is, and hopefully ASR Analytics will help toward that end.
Yeah, excellent clarification. We relatively speaking, we're still very early in the game, so maybe I should rephrase the question to this point forward. What grade would you give the stimulus program? Jackie, we'll let you offer your comments.
Should I just speak, or should
Yeah.
I have to agree with Charles about the dedication of the staff. I mean, I became best friends with my program officer in round one. I was talking to this woman, like picking my daughter up from school Saturday morning, really trying to get to the bottom of some very complicated and new issues, obviously. And I also think that the program was ambitious in a lot of important ways. The focus on underserved and unserved audiences, but also the focus on sustainable adoption and public computing centers and really what that means in a 21st century sort of public. And I think those are, very new ideas for us in a lot of ways, and I think they really added a lot to what was, rightly the infrastructure focus of BTOC. I would have to give it a B because, I didn't get a grant, so. But I would give it a B+.
Well, that's gracious. Great. I'll take a B+ any day of the week. How about you, Craig?
Well, I would give it a grade of an A+ for completing the process, because getting $7 billion and some change out the door in 16 months, going from zero, no structure to implementation. However, more along the lines of a C+ for decisions made, because I think some of the decisions, I'm not sure what the benefit's going to be, and some of the decisions were not what I would have expected. And so as a result, I feel like it's a mixed bag. And and for where we are right now, I think that's where it'll stand. Time will tell on the long run whether how many of these decisions were good or bad or somewhere in between.
Laura?
I would probably give it an A- for a few reasons, having gone through the process both in round one when we did not receive a grant and then turning that around in round two. It was a long haul going through the due diligence processes, which I think in some ways could have been a lot more efficient. That said, the execution and of what they were trying to do at an agency that didn't have the full staffing that it deserved for a program deployment of this magnitude was tremendous. And, one other, I guess, small little criticism, not so much a criticism rather than a miscommunication, is part of the stimulus bill. There's a great number of folks in America who think that stimulus already happened. And, in fact, it hasn't yet occurred for the broadband portion of it. We are yet to draw down a dime of funds that we've received, and so the estimated 1,700 jobs that in Maryland we estimate will be created are yet to be created. So I think that if you're talking about stimulus, it's a bit of a delayed stimulus, but it will have an impact. But that's one thing that folks in the country aren't really talking about right now.
Great. Well, this is interesting. We've got a pretty positive response to the program. Certainly there are no shortage of critics and no shortage of criticism surrounding the implementation of the program, execution of the program. And there's also been some really early success stories as well, some that I'm very familiar with, companies that are well into building networks and well into creating jobs and all of the benefits that the stimulus program was supposed to bring. Since we have the element of hindsight here and what's happened to this point, I wonder if you would pick one element of the program that you think did not go so well. In other words, an element that in your opinion was kind of handled in the wrong way, as well as on the flip side of that, an element that you think has gone very well, something that has gone very well with the program. So Charles, we'll start with you again.
Well, I was with several people, including Joanne Hovis, last October, went around town and talked to the Strictly and his folks and Adelstein at RUS, folks at the White House, et cetera, about the need for evaluating and having a research and evaluation. If this was just a jobs program, we were really selling it short and not building an infrastructure to figure out what lessons we learned and what are the best practices and how can we make generalizations from what did work for the future. So I think in fact, the woman that we were working with, especially in this from the University of Illinois, had something called DEEPER, the data engine for policy and research, which everyone was very intrigued with, and said, "Yep, we like what you're saying, but Congress didn't put it in, and there's no funding for it. Apart from that, it's great." So, it is, I think, gratifying. They finally came around to investing some money in the research and evaluation. I don't know about RUS. I don't know where they sit on this. I think it's late, and I'm sorry ASR Analytics isn't here, as I've said before, to explain this further, see where all this is leading. I think on the good news, I know that the folks in the governor's office in Illinois got a call from the SBDD, State Broadband Data and Development leaders and MTIA saying, look, for round two, we want fewer projects, bigger projects. You coordinate. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a very, very good message and led the folks at the state level in the governor's office, Lori Sorensen, head of the Illinois Century Network, and Drew Clark, who was out working on this as well, to move from 25 or 30 applications to 6 that the state got behind with its matching money, and therefore not only encourage but really push people to work together so that we could address this in a more holistic way and not just a lot of miscellaneous projects, but have a whole larger than sum of the parts. And I think that leadership on the part of NTIA to push the governor's office to say, look, we want bigger projects, more coordination, fewer projects, and 4 of those 6 projects were funded. And I think it is a great tribute to the NTIA to take the lead on this and help us be true to our best selves.
Jack?
The two things that I would say are the best and the worst, or the
Good and the bad?
Good and the bad, however you phrase it, are very related to me. I mean, I think one of the really good things about the VTOP, as has already been discussed, is the speed at which it happened. I think, when you talk about digital media and you talk about this sort of rapidly evolving delivery systems, I think you have to move fast. And I think that NTIA did a great job with that. I think, however, the compromise that was made was really, in my opinion, around innovation. That particularly on the SBA front, which is the only thing I can talk about, I don't think that there was time to really dig deeply into sort of models that have worked and even evaluate data from models that haven't worked. I mean, when I look at what was funded for sustainable broadband adoption, you see a lot of very similar themes around digital literacy and low-cost hardware that, when you really look at what's been done in certain places hasn't worked, and that I think that the reliance on sort of proven metrics that you can say, well, we're going to do this plus this is going to equal that, is really, at the end of the day, what they were looking for. When if you're really talking about innovation, you can't promise that. I mean, if you're really talking about innovation, you're really talking about risk-taking, and you're talking about creating new models for impact and new models for relevancy. And we know that a lot of the barriers for adoption are not price or not cost. They're really relevance and people's understanding of why this technology is integral to their lives as citizens in a 21st century democracy. And I think that part of it was lost in the speed.
Great.
Well, I think on the positive side, having separated the focus between middle mile projects and last mile projects, giving each agency a focus on each of those was good, because these are very distinct pieces of the puzzle, but at the same time you can't have one without the other. So to clearly delineate, we're going to put miles and miles of infrastructure to move the data between cities and between institutions is fine, and you have a focus on that. And then you have this focus on the last mile where the networks actually interface with the various constituency groups is another piece of the puzzle. Now, I guess in time we'll figure out how many of these things actually do connect. Because if you have middle mile in one state and you have last mile in another state, they're not touching each other, that could be a problem. But conceptually, separation was good. On the downside, following along the lines of some of the stuff that Jackie talked about, I felt that there was not a creativity on staff. It was basically, and what I mean by that is people who could understand if a proposal was creative and had good potential for success versus a proposal that may have been creative with zero potential for success versus, yet again, we're funding the same thing because it's safe. And you can't really delineate with this kind of technology what's safe versus what's creative unless you have people that have been in the business, that have actually been out there dealing with different communities and different projects. I mean, someone brought out the point that there were a lot of fiber projects funded, again, because they were safe, but also because wireless and some of the more creative aspects of wireless has only been going on for a couple of years. We've had wireless community broadband networks for a long period of time, and they've had a mixed set of successes and failures. But that we haven't had a long enough experience with those, nor do we have technology that's kind of shaken itself out the way fiber has. But nevertheless, there would still be projects in there worth evaluating if you have people on staff who have been in that world. And so if we were to look forward and say, well, what do you recommend? Well, part of a application review committee needs someone from these industries and someone who's been out there dealing with some of the more recent successes that have come about.
Or
the part of the difficulty in working through round 1 and round 2 was getting NTIA to accept and understand a model that was different. To Jackie's point, I think there were times when we went back and forth with the same information. Please send us your historical financials. What's your balance and asset sheet? Well, we're a government. We can't put our numbers on a form like a private company will. And so there was a difficulty with trying to get them to accept differences within their forms and some of the program documents that they created. There was a lot of struggle with that. At the end, NTIA overcame that and was able to, obviously award projects and governments, and a lot of municipal government projects were awarded. But there was definitely some difficulty having, and particularly with some of the consultants that the NTIA was working with, had some tough times with that. On the positive side, as I mentioned, they did overcome that and ultimately rewarded projects of different models, of different types, public-private partnerships. The difference between round 1 and round 2 was astounding in terms of the approach and the welcoming of these different CCI models that I think ultimately the project will be remembered for, the program will be remembered for a lot of the round 2 projects.
So Drew alerted me to the fact that we do have an official or a representative from RUS in the audience. I'm not sure where they're. Here we are, right up front here. So feel free to jump in and offer any commentary you might have on some of this. I think that'll give me the opportunity to kind of move into the audience here and see if anyone who's going to be the first taker on a question to the panel. First one's always the hardest, right? Here we are. Please announce yourself as well.
So my name is Bruce Lincoln. I'm the entrepreneur in residence at the Columbia School of Engineering. I'm a colleague of Jackie's. And one thing that I'm very interested in, and I'm glad you touched upon it, are the different models and some of the more innovative projects. Could you articulate your vision of some of these, more creative and innovative approaches you would take to the broadband solutions that we need?
That's to Jackie, right? To everybody.
Well, I mean, when I said earlier that there seemed to be a reliance on a model that didn't necessarily work, one of the things that does seem to work is sort of using influential actors in communities to really drive demand. And our idea around public media, because we work with public media for 30 years, is that there's always been a disconnect between the kind of content that we think is in the public interest and the actual public. And that broadband offers this opportunity to sort of connect the dots in a way. Like one of the things that was astounding to me about what was happening with BTOP and what was happening with the rest of the stimulus funding was this idea that a lot of these government services were moving online. And yet that wasn't really something that was front and center in terms of the BTOP process. And even the people in our communities, when we talk to them and say, do you realize the connection between the fact that you will no longer have physical access to an unemployment office and the fact that you need to know how to use a computer? And there was like no connection between these two things. And I think those kinds of public awareness approaches and sort of community-based approaches where you're recognizing the power of media and also the power of technology to do a sort of a service, a public service role. I think that opened up the opportunity to be more creative around our approaches to adoption more than saying, well, let's give public libraries more computers so people can go in there and use them. I mean, we had a great example in D.C. recently where there were like 11,000 free Microsoft certifications that were available to low-income residents of Washington, D.C. Over 10,000 of them were returned unused because people didn't know about them, didn't understand the connection of that to anything. You know what I mean? And I think that that's where there's a lot of room to really say, well, like what is happening in communities? How are people using technology? How can we use the assets that we have to really drive people in a meaningful way toward a culture of use that's not specific around a particular application or a particular function? And I think that culture of use was what was undervalued in terms of the projects that were funded, as far as what I saw.
Let me give you 3 examples from Illinois. The Smart Communities Project, which is funded both under the Computer Center, Public Computer Center, and the Sustainable Broadband programs, was essentially built upon the report done by the Mayor's Committee on the Digital Divide called the Citybit Networks. So a lot of the work had been done prior to the selection of these 5 communities in Chicago, 3 predominantly black and 2 predominantly Hispanic. I think that Smart Communities project has potentially very big implications for urban America in application of broadband, and we're also focused on the research with the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, with University of Illinois in Chicago. The second project is one involving low-income elderly in public housing. Boy, if they can make that work, I mean, that's got huge potential. That really has got huge potential. And the people that are My Way Village folks in Boston are the leaders in that project. Very smart guy in Illinois. That's one to watch, and it could be really very exciting. The third one is the UC2B, the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, where the fiber system is being laid. And there is quite a bit of low income and poor folks in those 2 communities, believe it or not, with the huge employer overarching University of Illinois campus. But that'll be a fiber to the home project, which is most of the fiber has been laid with the anchor institutions. But this is a fiber to the home project, which is one of the few, and therefore one to watch again as a very interesting model. So those are 3 innovative models, I think, in Illinois that hopefully that we're going to be watching very carefully, and hopefully the country can learn from. We can learn from.
I'm a little biased on the model, but in Maryland, I think one of the successes is that there's a recognition from the federal government that municipal governments who have been building networks for over a decade have a role in this broadband deployment into the community. And what we did was we combined 10 Central Maryland governments, 8 counties and 2 cities, leveraging existing networks. With BTOP money, we'll build out a 1,200-mile interconnected network with the state that will touch every county in the state. Aside from the benefits of government efficiency and saving money, and we estimate, at least in the Central Maryland portion, the county governments will save somewhere along the lines of $28 million a year annually by having our own networks, but interconnected, and the interoperability between the public safety agencies that will be connected to the network. But there's a tremendous opportunity for private sector and nonprofit involvement, for innovation, for economic development. The biotech community, some of the other high-tech businesses in other areas in Maryland will be able to access our dark fiber for innovation, for where they won't have to go to a carrier to negotiate a 2-year lease for limited speeds, they'll be able to get the speeds that they need to foster the development and the innovation for the businesses in Maryland. Not to mention that we've been speaking with private sector companies who want to utilize our middle mile for wireless applications to go into the community in unserved and the underserved areas. But I think overall, once you put a network like this in place, the opportunity for community involvement down to the libraries and the senior centers, which are a part of our project as well, and the economic development or applications are limitless. And one of the things that we're talking about doing is actually holding a contest for some of the for applications to come over the network to foster that innovative thinking.
Okay, well, as the panel's token left coast radical thinking individual from Cal Berkeley, I'm going to throw in a fairly radical thought. I think the issue of, do we try to focus on the model and try to sort of find this winning model is wrong. I feel that what needs to happen is we need a different process by which we make money available for these kinds of projects. We seem to have a Washington-centric approach to a number of broadband policies, which then get reflected in legislation and eventual programs that come to be. And I feel like with broadband, the nature of the technology is such, and the nature of different communities having distinctly different needs are such, that decision-making for money and projects and what should be funded and shouldn't be funded need to be more focused down at the community level. I've worked for the corporate side for many years longer than the government side. And in all of my past preachings, teachings, books, and reports, it's always been about what does the end user need, and that need defines technology, and then that technology need as defined then determines what decisions you make, what money you put into which projects, and so forth. We need that in broadband projects and policy, because I can go to 10 different communities that will have very distinct issues that dictate a certain type of model is or isn't going to work. There is no way for a group of people in Washington to grasp and understand all of those different variations, especially when you're trying to pump a lot of money in a short period of time to a lot of places. So if we're going to actually have innovative projects be funded, if we're going to actually have broadband turn communities around, we need to just basically say, here's a block of money, here's a basic set of criteria, to deal with fraud and abuse and all those things that make politicians very nervous, and move this discussion down to the people who have the need, who have the pain, and have the problem. And unless and until we do that, these exercises are going to have a limit on their effectiveness. And I believe that truly because I'm in the different counties, I'm in communities, I'm talking to people, getting their feedback, and there's a major disconnect between we the people and we the people that have all this money to give out. So.
Can I just add something to the lefty guy? I have to say I could not agree more with that last point. I think there's an incredible disconnect. And the reality is that, and this is what motivated us to get into the broadband space, is that there are a tremendous amount of resources within public media, within public television, public radio. There are millions and millions of dollars that get spent every year developing curricula around any number of American history, civics, math, early childhood that go unused. It's not that the resources aren't there, it's not that the technology is not there, it's not that the goodwill is not there, but they go unused because they're not connected to immediate needs of communities. And I think you're right. Communities have different kinds of needs, and unless you're an actor in that community, you don't know what they are. And that's what I was referencing earlier, is that, one of the projects that we uncovered when we were trying to answer questions in the first round of due diligence was this amazing thing that happened in Atlanta, where they provided low-cost service, free hardware, training, and after the funding for the project ended, the project ended. The use and adoption ended. You know what I mean? And you have to look at those things and say, well, you know, why all that money went into that? Why didn't it create a culture of use around broadband, even though it's clearly useful in that community?
So somewhat tangential to Craig and Jackie's last point there is this debate about private versus public networks and how the stimulus program, which should it fund? You know, there are passionate arguments on both sides of this equation regarding which is better suited to build and operate these broadband networks for the unserved and underserved. So I'm interested in the panelists' view on this. Where do you come down on this private versus public debate? I think we know your answer, Lori, but why don't we start with Charles on that?
Well, I think the point that Lori made about the need to recognize a legitimate role for public leadership where the private sector has not been able to contribute as we might hope is a really, really good point. I was recently, last year, in Lafayette, Louisiana, which I think is the largest municipal publicly owned broadband facility. And the mobilization of the community around this by the city, who also had the public utility, the electricity, public ownership, was really nothing short of inspiring. They're building a very interesting model there. Certainly something we need to watch. Craig, I want to just, while I've got the microphone here, I want to come in with a different point of view to yours. I understand your point about meeting community needs, and that's absolutely fundamental. But I think there is when we don't have unlimited money, $6.9 billion is a lot of money for the stimulus, but as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the amount of money that's being invested by the private sector annually, it's not all that much. And so the only way to make progress is by building models. And figure out what works through that and what doesn't work, and then figuring out how to sustain those models and give them the kind of support. I go back to this low-income elderly folks in public housing. Man, that's a tough nut to crack. If we can crack that through this project with some dedication and working on computer ownership, computer literacy, the relevance issues for older folks, I really think that we could learn a lot from that, and that's a very important model. And you can't do that comprehensively. You got to try. You got to see what works, what doesn't work. And that's the American way, it seems to me, is building models and building from those and respecting what does work through evidence and facts. That is very much the American way, and I want to say I'm for models.
And the American way.
And the American way.
And you know, to build on that point, I would say there really is no one true model. The reality is that we need both public and private networks in this country, and it's the role of government to fulfill the void for the needs of its citizens in providing services to our customers, to the schools and libraries and other facilities. We want to enable the private sector to come in and also meet the needs of the residents in the private homes for broadband, for television, for phone, and all of the technology needs that we have. We can't do this alone, and they can't do it alone. And so I think, you know, which is why I'm biased in our model, because it includes both aspects of it, but I think there's plenty of room for both.
Anyone who's followed any of my readings know where my biases tend to lie, which is in two areas. One, I'm a strong proponent of the public sector being involved in network projects. I am a bigger proponent of each community deciding for itself what makes sense. In so many projects, whether we're building highways, schools, or swimming pools, communities may apply for federal grants, but nowhere do they have to worry about someone then telling them that they can hire this contractor or they can't hire that contractor or they can't build it themselves. Yet in the telecom industry, probably in large part because of the influence of large incumbents, we have a situation in which we basically say, you, the small community, if you decide you want to build and own a network, you can't do that. And I don't know where I must have been asleep in the civics class that said we will, forego the right of the community vote in favor of the free market system. I mean, that's just not how we work. And so I believe that where the government can do best from a federal standpoint is to remove the barriers from communities being able to make their own decision. Because we have legislation in place that prevents that. We have practice in place that prevents that. And I think in the end, communities are the ones that get screwed, to best put it very bluntly. And so what we need is not private sector versus public sector or nonprofit versus co-op. It is the community or a region of communities. They make the decision. They own the problem. They own the solution that gets put upon them. So they should have that right. Anything less than that is detrimental to broadband moving forward.
Anything to add, Jackie? Nope. Okay. Got one over here.
I'm a public person.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Gatt. I own a small boutique communications law firm, the Gatt Law Group, and I actually represented a couple of clients who filed applications to get grants in BTOP and NTIA. And I was struck by something that Craig just said. Everyone, Charles and Jackie and Craig and Lori just mentioned a couple of things that I was interested in. One, Craig's reference to communities. I guess my concern is that when you're dealing with public dollars here and community models and community projects are essential. However, the concern is where it's not tested in terms of models, like what Charles mentioned. Jackie mentioned an example of where there was a project that was funded. However, there wasn't that. It wasn't paired with adoption. So to put all this money, taxpayer dollars, into a project and then to have it, stop short of actually implementing to getting people to adopt, that's a problem. So you can have a model, but if and I think that might have been my frustration with the whole project. It wasn't paired enough. It was, there were distinct, insular, different targeted sections, and there wasn't a link. So there's a disconnect. So I'm nervous, like a year or two, what's going to happen to these projects. I'm just not confident that it's actually going to, it may not like immediate jobs in terms of for the infrastructure projects, and then adoption. There'll be some computers built and some centers, but I just don't see this where they're connecting and it's going to have actually a long-term impact and be effective. And Lori, congratulations. I'm in Maryland, so I'm going to benefit from the funds that you got. I think that is we need more models like that where there's pairing up with the infrastructure, with the adoption, with the computer use and centers to actually have the goal actually met. And I was just frustrated with the whole process, and I'm just not confident that it's, I don't know. That's just me.
I think on the infrastructure side, we need to start looking at this country in terms of, we know roads and utilities and things are infrastructure, but fiber is infrastructure of this century. And if we don't, we need a coordinated effort to build this infrastructure, which is why the government and the private sector need to come together. It's too massive an undertaking for one part to do it by itself. But as far as sort of the working model and the sustainability, we've been building networks for years on the local level. Now, some communities, to Craig's approach, have not been doing that, and it may not be as beneficial to start a project in that community. In Maryland, it made sense. For example, for us in the cost savings, we are going to be saving thousands and thousands of dollars in taxpayer money by not having to lease poor bandwidth circuits from carriers that we can't afford to purchase more bandwidth. So by directly connecting all of these schools, we'll be able to take that money and turn it back into the local government, into the networks, and make it sustainable. But I think that's part of what NTIA did, was look at these projects and vet which ones they felt were sustainable, not just looking at your past performance and your financial history, but also moving forward to see, based on their experience and their due diligence, what will succeed.
I mean, and there's I was just going to say there's a big difference, I think, in terms of the sustainability of an infrastructure project and the sustainability of an adoption project, which I think is partly what you're talking about. And in terms of the sustainable adoption piece, I think it is, I mean, it's a more complicated sort of nuanced thing because, and this is my personal frustration with even with the term digital literacy. It's like that's really insufficient in 21st century global commerce. You know what I mean? Literacy is like the lowest possible bar to set on this thing. And very few of the applications really, like Philadelphia was one that I thought was really good, that really called out, media production as something that for young people is a driver for demand. People want to be heard. They want to have a platform. This is part of what this technology enables. And without really building those sort of core values into the adoption, I think you are going to end up with a lot of, examples like the Atlanta example where you put money into something and people have the benefit of training, but is it used after 2 years? Or is it used to, we did a survey in Anacostia recently, and one of the really surprising things in our survey was that there were 51% of the people have broadband in the home, but about 5% of that use the broadband for news and information. Over 75% of the people still rely on commercial television news as their primary source of news and information. You know what I mean? So what does that mean? Like, what does that adoption mean? And I think this is the thing where in 16 months or 18 months, you can't get deeply into that kind of a texture of what we're talking about. And that would be my one criticism, is that I think these are profound issues for our society, and we are creating this very divided, once again, nation where you have people who do not understand what this conversation we're having is about. And that's just the bottom line of it. And until we address that, then the adoption is going to be roughly what it is today. It's going to go up. I think we all know adoption is a short-term problem. At some point, everybody's going to be online. But what they're going to be doing online is what the question is.
If I can add an item. I just wrote a column this week for GigaOM that addresses what I think is the core of some of our problems, including the one that Jennifer just brought up, which is at a policy level, at a national policy level, we get fixated on certain concepts. One of them, which makes my blood kind of go off the chart, blood pressure go off the chart, is this focus on speed. We've established a broadband speed goal of 4 megabits for rural areas. We've established a secondary goal of 100 megabits for 100 million homes, which, you read between the lines, you're basically saying urban areas, right? Besides the disparity issue, of saying basically rural America, you have to be satisfied with 4 megabits, which I find appalling in its own right. The speed issue takes away from the reality of what do you want to do. We get so fixated and we want to, we're behind the rest of the free world in broadband. Okay, technically, yes, that's true. But all that does is says at a speed comparison, we're behind 15 industrialized countries. Great. The question, though, is we talk about broadband being a transformative technology, but transforming to what? What is it that you want to do in economic development? What is it that you want to do in education? What is it that you want to do in workforce development? And so instead of establishing some of these criteria, which becomes sort of a tick list, I think really it comes down to what questions are you asking and what questions do you want people to answer. I think the question we should ask people is, okay, we've got this pool of money. We think it should address, economic development and so forth. How is it going to address this? How is your proposal going to address economic development in your community? And if so, who have you talked to make the business case that you're presenting to us? Did you talk to 10 of your closest friends and the mayor? Did you do a survey of 500 businesses in your community? What did you do to come to this conclusion that this proposal makes sense? Why did you decide that you wanted to go with wireless versus wired or some hybrid? In other words, instead of giving people this mandated policy of, if you reach 4 megabits, you're done, we give you some money and go have a nice life. This is not going to solve our problems. The same way with the broadband adoption issue. Right? We just did a survey of economic development professionals, and the thing that we have just given hundreds of millions of dollars away for, computing centers, broadband adoption programs, the economic development professionals, the people that are actually in the trenches, that was the low end of their, what is it that we need? From their perspective, they felt that people needed better, faster access to better broadband. That was like top of their list. Because the fact that it's available doesn't mean it's useful, what they have options to choose and buy from. Right? The second thing on their list was we need to use broadband to teach individuals how to develop wealth. That is a different objective than we need to get a community up to 4 megabits or even 100 megabits. It's the outcome. It's like, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to create a digital workforce that's ready for the 21st century? And then you let the people tell you how they're going to get there, and you probe and you prod and you try to do the due diligence to figure out if their rationale is sound. And then you make a decision on whether you're going to give them money or not. But it's all about the need. It's not about the speed. It's not about the technology. It's not about building 1,000 computing centers. Because you end up with a situation like Jackie described. Great, you build a computer center, you put technology in it, you run a bunch of people through there, and you made them great consumers of technology. They can figure out YouTube, and they can figure out Facebook. They can't do jack for getting a new job, right? Because we have set the wrong criteria for what we're trying to fund. This is the problem, in my humble opinion.
I can add, I appreciate your youthful impatience. Speaking as an old guy who's been around for a long time, I'm thinking in the previous administration, the policy was no policy, none of our business. Let the private sector do it. That's clearly not the right policy. Not that the government has got all the answers, absolutely not, but there is a role, and so the public-private sector cooperation. Bear in mind, the National Broadband Plan was built into ARRA. Actually, Ed Markey was the guy that got it as a part of the plan that was passed in February of 2009, and then came forth in the end of March of 10 this year. And it lays out a very ambitious 3-part plan. Investment in innovation is the first part. Inclusion is the second part. And national purposes is the third part. There's a lot to be done here. And if you think about linking the technology to meeting basic national needs, jobs in the economy, education, healthcare, energy and the environment, and reinvigorating our democracy, public safety, security, these 6 areas actually. We're just at the beginning. I mean, broadband is relatively new in the large scheme of things. So you got to be patient, and it's better, let's not make the best the enemy of the good. Better to make some progress than that we haven't got all progress simultaneously. So be patient. This is a good start. And it's interesting that the infrastructure is 90% of the money. So to build this infrastructure, and this is the 21st century infrastructure, Lori was saying, you've got electricity and water. We assume these things are there. Well, a telephone, we assume it was there. Well, broadband is next. And it's going to take some time to get there. I mean, so be patient. But keep pushing. No problem.
Got one here.
Nick Miller with Miller Van Eaton, and I represent local governments in this area. But actually, it's a message to Drew. Where is Drew? I would really like to see the next broadband breakfast be a review of what is the longitudinal studies that NTIA and RUS are putting in place to actually measure results to document and to share those lessons learned. And I want to come back to the point about sustainability. In this economy, in this country, things are sustainable because someone's willing to spend money on them. In fact, I think Lori sits there as probably the person who is representative of the group that is, there's not going to be any more federal money, guys, okay? So the question is, what lessons do we learn from what's been given so that folks who do have money to spend say, oh, I would like a piece of that. And I honestly think state and local governments is where that is. And the reason is I think they've been victimized for a long period of time through artificially rationed shortage of broadband and overpricing, that if they can actually see demonstrations of social services that are more efficient to develop, education results that are cheaper and better, and communications and public safety services that are delivered more inexpensively, if they do it themselves or in a different way, then the money's there in the existing governmental budgets to redirect, to sustain these projects on an ongoing basis. There's going to be a huge fight in the next year to suppress all that information. And that's why documenting and cataloging this is going to be so important.
Nick, you're right on. Absolutely. You're fighting the good fight here. And the longitudinal studies you've asked for, I mean, thank God Larry put up the $5 million and at least and put out an RFP so that there will be some serious professional studies on this. But you're absolutely right. There will be probably, at least in the immediate future, there will unlikely be any further federal funding on this. So we got to learn the lessons from what we have and apply those lessons at the state and local levels. It's really interesting when the ARA funding came down when the bill was passed in February of 2009. Mayor Daley called Terry Mazzani, who was the head of the Chicago Community Trust, and he said, Terry, we got a big opportunity here. Will you mobilize the philanthropic community in Chicago so we can get the most out of this federal money that's going to be pouring in here? Well, $2 billion poured in from all the various different, from energy, from education, from commerce, et cetera, into various programs out of the $3 billion that were requested in the Chicagoland metropolitan area. And that money was a catalytic agent for getting the foundations and philanthropic folks to work with the city guys and figure out how to make the most out of this money and set up new working relationships and infrastructures that would help all this. And while I mostly attended these quarterly meetings just to listen, at the last meeting I got up and said, look, there's one area here that touches everything, and that's broadband. And so we need to have one more meeting that's focused on broadband and what it is doing for you, what it has done and could do for you in healthcare, in education, in public safety security, in energy and the environment, et cetera. Taking these national purposes and applying them locally. That should be done. And it is a long struggle. It's not going to happen quickly, but the opportunities are there. And these models, Greg, that are being built here, we can learn lessons from them. And the key issue is sustainability. How do we apply those lessons and then politically, both through the political process and philanthropic process and other and private sector investments, how can we bring all these folks to the table to get the job done?
And Charles, Bill, in some ways we have a good old case of supply and demand economics here, because what drives the supply is the demand. And I think there was an article yesterday about the usage of smartphones and how they're going to double in the next couple of years. Everyone is going to be walking around with a smartphone. So you may see whoever's developing applications start coming up with applications for how you pay your water bill and things like that. If you start being able to access government services and other things through your smartphone, that will drive some of the broadband adoption for fiber to the home and other sorts of things where people want to do more and more and more. The same thing with video games and video. That is going to be driving a lot of the speed and the demands for access.
Have one here.
Thank you. I'm Claiborne Crane with the House Committee on Agriculture. Served some time at the USDA and the RUS program. Wanted to, there's a whole lot of things I would love to say and go into. Drew's told me I can't give speeches here, so I will stick to questions. But a number of things that you've raised are good, thoughtful things. I think, Mr. Settles, your comments on making use of broadband is extremely important. And that's something I've argued for several years, is a community needs to know what they're going to do with it, because just putting broadband in there is not an end to itself, just like putting a road in there if you don't know how it's going to be used. But the thing I would like to focus on a little bit is where should we be going from here? We know that the stimulus, the impact of the stimulus is going to be several years out. But what happens next in the world of broadband? How do we get people to do the type of things that he was talking about on making use of it, knowing how it fits into economic development? We know pretty well with the communities, the public safety factor, the education factor, the efficiency in governing, but where do we go next? And let me say that we've fought the battle with the phone companies going all the way back to the 2002 Farm Bill, where we had our first broadband funds for RUS, that they wanted to ban local government from being a player in it. I frankly was in favor of letting the big providers be a player if they would come in and provide broadband where it's not. But my question really is, where do we go from here? What's the vision?
If I can maybe start this one, I would look to the Google Fiber phenomenon as a starting point to figure out where to next. What Google Fiber did, for those who happen to miss all of the hype and craziness around that, was they walked up to the plate and said, if you had a gigabit, what would you do with it? We are going to maybe give you some sort of network to one, maybe it'll be 3 lucky cities. We're not going to be very clear on what we're going to give you, but what we want to know is, what would you do if you had this capacity? And then in your most creative way, how would you present that to us so that we would say that your solution is the best solution to move forward? That one effort, which cost them very little money, galvanized literally hundreds of communities across the U.S. to actually think about, talk about, become actively engaged in the discussion of broadband. There were cities and towns that had 10, 12,000 people on Facebook all talking about, we want broadband. 200,000 people wrote letters to Google saying, this is why our community needs broadband, right? So while you have in Washington, the incumbent side saying, who needs a gigabit? They don't need it. Why would government spend money on that? You have, agencies offering, clearly, $7 billion to get people's applications, right? Which they achieved a certain level of success there. But here's Google that just turned it all around and gave people a very simple vision, and then all of a sudden all of these ideas bubbled up. Now, Google may or may not give a city a dime, but there are a number of these communities that once they did the planning, once they galvanized the people, once they identified stakeholders and potential customers on the network, decided that what the heck, we are going to find ways to make these networks a reality. I just turned the needs assessment proposal over to a city council and said, here, for what you want to do in economic development, you need this, and it's going to cost you $2 million in a bad economic time. And what happened at that city council meeting was when they saw what the possibilities were, they started thinking of creative ways to address the funding issue. So the question of where we go next is really about what vision do we create and instigate, if you will, that will motivate people to come up with their own way. Right? And if we hadn't seen it happen, a year ago, this might have been considered a wild idea. But again, you look at it and, Google didn't promise you anything. There was no dollar sign attached pot of gold. Yet there are 1,000 plans out there for broadband all across America, and people are figuring out we can do this with or without them, right? We, at one point in America, had a vision to go to the moon when rocket ships were held together with duct tape and bubble gum. But we were all committed to that vision because it was beyond what our expectations were. Yet we just went through a funding process where the benchmark was like 4 megabits of speed. I mean, in round one, it was like 720K. It was ridiculous and it was pathetic, right? There was no vision there, but there was a lot of money, right? What we need is a better vision, and then we can figure out a lot of these money-related issues. We can figure out the models issues. Things will bubble up, but we're just. I feel like we limit ourselves, or government limits us, or government and industry limit us because they want to sell what they have, not what we need. All of these things work against us, and they just got to throw some of this stuff out and come back and create a vision. And that's leadership. The next step from a government perspective should be we don't need a speed goal. We need a vision that says, America, what can you do with this technology? And we'll give you some pathways. We will, collect information. We will maybe collect a database of, successful broadband projects that are government-run, private sector-run. And here, take this and figure it all out. But we are going to lead you by giving you a vision. And if we in the room don't have that vision, then I think we need to force the issue of forcing them to make that vision, to think differently and approach this thing differently.
Let me address your point even more specifically, perhaps. Broadband in rural America is fundamental. It is absolutely fundamental. You're blessed in that you've got a really good guy in Jonathan Adelstein running RUS with his experience at the FCC, and before that with the former Majority Leader, Senator Daschle, who really understands rural issues. So you've got a leader in place here who is first rate. You also have at RUS a tradition of funding technology and broadband. So this isn't just the $2.5 billion. By the way, it's very interesting that when Congress clawed back the $300 million, there was $300 million that was supposed to be clawed back from RUS as well as from NTI, but RUS held firm. Why? Because of the power of rural America in the Senate. Very simple. I mean, the House is rural America. Is urban America and the great power in the Senate. So it was the $2.5 billion was maintained. Anyway, the viability of rural America, farming sector and all sectors, really depends fundamentally on the information infrastructure, and so broadband and in Illinois. These statewide regional networks, IBOP we call them, Illinois Broadband Opportunity Program, and we've got 4 statewide regional networks that we're trying to mesh in together. So I would say that and again following up Nick's point, we're not going to get much more funding from the federal government, though there will be ongoing from Russ, thank God, but the focus needs to shift now to the states and localities. States in particular. It's interesting that the $350 million state broadband data development program has funded these state efforts through 2014. So there is money. I mean, our little organization in the Partnership for Connected Illinois has got essentially $2 million for 4 years. We can do a lot with that. We can do a lot with that with the money that's there and raising more money from the private sector and maybe even from state government through bonds. Who knows? We're working on all fronts. But the states are going to be sources of innovation and continuity here, and you want to look to the states for not only models but a sustained effort, especially in rural America.
Sort of the what next question. Well, I think from a practical standpoint, you'll see a lot of building over the next couple of years. You'll see a lot of building before you start seeing the innovative technologies applications on the lit networks. But during that time, I think there could be some need for some FCC and Congress to take a look at some of the laws that are in place to help deploy these networks and protect them while they're being deployed, and give them the legal tools and the framework that's out there in order to enable both public and private networks to be built within the confines of the BTOP rules, as well as modernize some of the laws and legal frameworks that are around today that make it difficult for us to maneuver in this.
Okay, folks, I think we're just about out of time. Maybe one more. If not, I'm going to turn it back over to Drew.
Thank you, Bernie. Before I thank our moderator and our panelists for being here, I want to make just 3 quick announcements. First is you have a survey form on your table. If you could please fill it out. This will help us as we fine-tune the agenda for the next breakfast clubs. And I do want to, again, call your attention to the next one. The Broadband Breakfast Club will be on Tuesday, November 16th on public safety's roll-in and the need for better quality broadband. And then in January, will Congress reopen the 1996 Telecommunications Act? You know, one thing on this panel that we didn't hear a lot about that I think is teed up for future ones is what used to be called the Universal Service Fund, but I've begun calling the Universal Broadband Fund, because everyone recognizes that broadband is where things are going, and there's a lot of questions about how this broadband stimulus effort will interrelate with the many carriers and players who are participants in the current Universal Service Fund. So those are issues to be ironed out, and we try to get as many perspectives as we can at these broadband breakfast clubs. You can't always get every perspective, but we do value each of these speakers and our moderator for being here. So if you could please join me in thanking our sponsors.
May I have your attention, please? A fire emergency has been reported in the building. Please.
So as we leave, please join me in thanking National Cable and Telecommunications Association, Telecommunications Industry Association, U.S. Telecom, and our great speakers and moderator. Thank you.